When it comes to games, there's a certain distinction that I feel has to be made. That distinction is whether or not the game is good or great. While many would think that these are similar, in my opinion, there's a stark difference between the two terms when it comes to games. Good games are games that are fun to play that stand the test of time. They're games that I'm perfectly happy to go back to at any time and not struggle to play for whatever reason. Great games, however, are games that have left a lasting legacy. They're games that will always have a place in the history of the gaming industry. Now you might be wondering why I'm explaining this. That would be because I feel like while Pokemon Red and Blue are great games, they are not good games. The games themselves are antiquated, completely lacking in quality of life, and playing them might as well be a form of personal torture. However, they are great games because they started one of my favorite gaming franchises that was a significant factor in how I grew up. Pokemon itself is the largest media franchise in the world for good reason, but despite the massive size it's ballooned to, its roots are just troubled. I think Red and Blue were fine for a first step. However, as games nowadays, there's nearly zero reason to go back and play them when better options exist. There is a reason that they've been made again multiple times. For this small retrospective, I went back and loaded up Pokemon Blue and played through as much of it as I could stomach. In the past, I've beaten the trilogy of international releases a few times, but the state of the game just makes it a struggle to get through it every time I try. Despite that, let's dive into what exactly makes these games so great, yet kind of bad at the same time. The one thing that I thankfully don't feel any need to criticize are the graphics of the games. The art style remains extremely nostalgic and charming despite the many years since the game first came out. To this day, the Game Boy remains one of the best for minimalistic graphic styles to date. One of the best aspects of the art style has to be the sprite work in the battles. About half the sprites are absolutely fantastic, with some of the clear winners being Pokemon like the starters, Chubby Pikachu, and my favorite sprite, Haunter. The other half of the sprites end up going the other direction, being so goofy that they end up being charming, like Golbat. Overall, there's not really anything wrong with the presentation of the game itself, as it remains a nostalgic example of early portable gaming graphics on limited hardware. Later on, games like Crystal truly finished the vibe that Red and Blue started, bringing the early Pokemon art style to its fullest potential. When it comes to music, the Game Boy sadly wasn't able to handle much. However, despite that, Red and Blue were able to accomplish quite a bit with what they had. Areas like Lavender Town are some of the tracks that most people tend to think about, including myself, where the vibe of the Router Town is perfectly encapsulated in the music of the games. Even to this day, Pokemon has been able to continue this, with the music of the games remaining one of the major consistent aspects. Sound effects are a bit less so, however, with many of them being grating on the ears, forcing me personally to play the game at a much lower volume than I prefer. Sound effects like the ones attached to attacks, and worst of all, the low health warning tone are difficult on the ears. Thankfully, in later games, they've made it so that the warning tone stops after a few beeps, rather than playing constantly like it does in the early games. Some might consider it a hot take, but I do fully believe that the first generation of the games are the worst in the franchise. The gameplay suffers the most with the limitations and lack of experience with the franchise that the devs had at the time. There are quite a few things that I want to speak of in regards to gameplay, so let's hop right in. First off, one of the main issues that the game struggles with is poorly formed mechanics. While the basis for the systems that made the later games great is there in the first generation, there are many issues with move availability and move effects that plague the pacing of the game as a whole. Some of the issues that many people tend to point out in this regard is the fact that psychic types have little to no weakness in the game, making them quite good at steamrolling through it. Pokemon like Alakazam are able to move through the game with relative ease compared to Pokemon of other types. It wasn't until the introduction of Dark types in the second generation, and the addition of more Bug-type attacks, that the Psychic type became more balanced as a whole. One issue that plagues the game that I find much more serious, however, is the move pools for each Pokemon. For the most part, the level up move pools are sparse on moves that match the Pokemon's type, forcing many to rely on TM or HM usage instead. Not only do the moves tend to be quite limited at this point in time, but they also struggle with the distinction between physical and special. It wasn't until Generation 4, when the physical special split happened, that each type had moves that met both forms of attack. The issue this causes in the first 3 generations is that some Pokemon had most of their stats in either attack or special. Thus, if they were part of a typing that didn't match that, they ended up being at a massive disadvantage overall. This also feeds back into the fact that Psychic types tended to be so powerful, as it was a typing that matched well with the stat allocation that they tended to have. While something like Gyarados had more points in attack, while the Water type was a special type. The next major issue that the game struggles with is item management. This is an issue that wasn't resolved until Generation 3, but even then Ruby and Sapphire only managed to put a band-aid on the problem until later. Generation 2 wasn't quite as bad, but both it and Generation 1 still had quite limited inventories. The way that you had to manage it was by storing items in the item PC, but even that was limited, with the total storage in the game adding up to a measly 70 items total. This means that if you want to gather every item in the game, you're bound to have to discard or sell usable items at some point. The list of TMs alone adds up to the max capacity of the item PC. In addition to that, there are some other quality of life issues that the game has, like the fact that you can't register key items like the bike, forcing you to go in your inventory every time you want to use it. Or a bigger example of an issue would be how you could only catch a certain amount of Pokemon before you would have to switch to a new box. Until you switched the box, you were unable to catch Pokemon, meaning if you run into a rare Pokemon or legendary, you could cause yourself to fail the encounter entirely. Now, all of this isn't to say that Red and Blue are horrible games. Even in the Pokemon franchise, it's very easy for people to argue over which game is the worst. There's also the leeway that you have to give it for it being the first game in the franchise. Thus, it can be fairly easy to rank Generation 1 higher due to the wealth of things that it does right, when later games just had to copy and improve rather than build from the completely blank slate that Red and Blue had to. So what does Generation 1 do right? There's a few aspects that jump out to me right off the bat, with the first being the scaling of challenge throughout the course of your adventure. A lot of people, when they think of bad scaling in a Pokemon game, will naturally think of Generation 2, and the fact that it has a massive gap midway through the first half of the game. A gap where there's little to no places to level that provide a good way to build up your team to the point needed for the last part of the first half before challenging the Elite Four. Generation 1, however, has a nice smooth curve all the way from the start to the Elite Four, with little to no point where you're forced to grind on wild Pokemon. This is on top of the fact that the world is a lot more open than one might think at first. This brings us to the second thing that the generation does very well, in that it provides a fairly open world where you can challenge multiple of the gyms in odd order, rather than linearly in a row. Many people don't realize this, but after you beat Misty in Generation 1 and get the ability to use Cut, you are then able to challenge the next 4 gyms in any order that you want. While the scaling does have a suggested order, there's nothing stopping you from skipping Surge just to go straight to Erika or even Koga. This begs the question, what exactly do we mean when we discuss open worlds in Pokemon games? Many people will say that the first open world Pokemon game is Scarlet and Violet, but I would argue that they are all open world games, as you can generally move about as you please through the map in all of them. While the routes might consist of mostly straight lines, and many of the games have you challenge them in a set order, Generation 1 set the standard for Pokemon games being wide open games where you can walk, run, bike, or fly to any city you want once you've visited it before. So, now, coming to the end of this short look back at Pokemon Red and Blue, I once again want to reiterate the claim that I made at the start of the video. Red and Blue, while not good games, are great games. They're games that set up a franchise to become the largest media franchise in the world. They're games that provided enjoyment and imagination to generations of kids around the globe. They're games that showed us just what a creature collecting game can do. They're games that helped turn the Game Boy into a handheld console that changed the face of the gaming industry. But good lord, do I not enjoy playing them nowadays.